Okay, and so today I'd like to talk about how to play over a diminished 7 chord. But first, if we think of doing a half diminished 7 chord, so a minor 7 flat 5, so say we're in the key of C major, and we do a minor 7 flat 5 in B, which is the 7th chord of C major. Well, we often just think about going up a half step from there and playing a C major scale and ending on the 7th, which is basically a Locrian scale, the 7th mode of major. But it's pretty easy just to think, go up a half step and do the major scale, because it's the 7th mode. So you can target the 7, think of it that way, but basically a Locrian scale could be played in this shape where you're basically going, right, because you're hitting that B. Whereas this is C major. Just go back to the 7th, like that. Okay, so that's how we play over a minor 7 flat 5 chord, or a half diminished chord, right? So the first way that I think of playing over a diminished 7 chord is basically just thinking, if I only alter that one note, the A, which becomes an A flat, so if I'm doing a B diminished 7 chord, if I have an A flat in that chord as opposed to A, we would call that the double flat 7 in that chord in B. So basically it's the same as the 6, but a double flat 7 for a B diminished 7 chord would be the A flat. Okay? So that means that chord is made up entirely of minor thirds. So each interval in the chord is symmetrical minor thirds going up. So you can, often think about with diminished 7 chords starting from any note of that chord. So you can have like B diminished 7 as like D diminished 7 as like F diminished 7 and so on, and A flat, right? Okay? So the only note that changes is A to A flat, right? So the simplest way to think right off the bat is, why don't we just change A to A flat in the scale, right? So we're going to be playing a C major scale with an A flat in it, right? Just like the Locrian from the B, but we're going to be playing C major, targeting the 7, okay? So the simplest way to think is just C major with an A flat in it, okay? So, okay, it ends on B if you want to go to C. So if I start on B, basically I have C major with an A flat there, and then it goes to B at the end. Okay? So again, the easy way to think of it is C major with A flat goes to B. Okay? Now, what that creates is an augmented second interval. Okay? So between A flat and B, that gives us an augmented second, which also sounds like a minor third, right? So sometimes, depending on the style of music, we might not want that interval in there. So we might only want a combination of half steps and whole steps, like in jazz and bebop and stuff. So instead of preferring to have that augmented second interval in the sound, we're just going to add the extra note so we don't have to have that stretch, So if we think of A flat, what if we just also add A, So we got, right? Then it goes up to B that way. So we have the A flat and also A. So we call that a bebop scale. So I call that the bebop diminished scale. So if you're thinking of this from a modal context, if we play a C major scale with an A flat in it, that is actually C harmonic major. Okay? Now, again, if we don't want to have that interval in the scale, we can play also the A in that scale. So again, I call this the bebop diminished scale. Okay? So basically it's like a C harmonic major with also the flat 7 added. So you have a double flat 7 and also a flat 7. Okay? So it's an 8-note scale as opposed to a 7-note scale. But it comes from the mode, the 7th mode of harmonic major. So all of your notes are natural in the scale, except you have an A flat also. So you could also just think of it as a C major scale, add A flat. So, right? But if you start from the 7th, and and then end on the 7th, that's basically the targeting notes that you're going to use to create that scale. However, shape-wise, I'm going to think of C major with added flat 6 in there. Okay. But in context to B, that's a double flat 7. So that is a common scale that is used over diminished 7 chords that is derived from a modal scale. So it's derived from the 7th mode of harmonic major with an added flat 7 as well. So basically, again, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 6, 6, 7, 1. Now we can also apply that same concept to the 7th mode of harmonic minor, which gives us almost the exact same scale as harmonic major, however it has an E flat in it. So in context to C, that's a flat 3, but in context to B, that's a flat 4. So basically the only difference between the 7th mode of harmonic major and harmonic minor would be that 4th in context to B. So you either have a perfect 4th or a flat 4, depending on which scale you use. So if you play the 7th mode of harmonic major, you have a perfect 4th. And if you play the 7th mode of harmonic minor, you're going to have a flat 4. Okay, that's the only difference virtually. And you can also add that same note at the end to where you have the flat 7 and the double flat 7, right? So it all just depends on context. Both scales are going to have the A flat in them anyways, which is the essential note of the chord, right? So if we're playing only chord tones, we can also do it that way, but that's not really a scale, those are just chord tones, right, of the actual chord. So basically, as long as we have the notes of the chord in the scale, the notes in between the chord tones aren't as important necessarily, as long as we hit the 1, the flat 3, the flat 5, and the double flat 7 of the diminished 7 chord. Now also, you will see people using symmetrical scales over diminished 7 chords, which are quite common. So for example, if you were playing in B diminished 7, what you would do is you would play B, and you would do a whole step, and then a half step, and then a whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, then a half step, all the way back up to B. So basically what it is it's just whole step, half step, whole step, half step. So some people call it the 2+1 scale. Sometimes I've heard it called the symmetrical diminished scale. Basically whatever you want to call that scale. I don't use that quite as often. I like that scale, but one of my favorite scales is kind of a variation on the harmonic major. So if we use the 7th mode of harmonic major, what I do is take out the 4th completely. So basically the notes become, instead of going to E at all, I just skip E altogether. So I go, I like that scale a lot. I think it sounds kind of cool. That's a kind of a fun one to use. And it's basically just doing the same thing as the 7th mode of harmonic major, right? But you're just taking out the 4th completely. In that context, I guess it's pretty similar as the 7th mode of harmonic minor. We're just taking out the E flat as opposed to the E, the flat 4 or the 4. So if you just delete the 4 altogether, you get... Okay, so let's check out how some of these scales sound. So if we play from the 7th mode of harmonic major over B diminished 7, it's going to sound like this. Right? Now if we add that flat 7 in there as well, we get the bebop diminished scale. So right? Okay. Or we can do the 7th mode of harmonic minor, which would be like this. Right? Or we can take the one that I was showing before, which is basically a mix of those without the 4th at all. So then also, of course, we could do our 2+1 scale. So right, and I like that one, but I don't use it quite as much. I kind of like the modal ones a bit better. And of course, you can just always do the minor thirds of a diminished 7 chord. Just all minor thirds, and you can add the notes in the scale. And kind of go in and out of the chord tones. You know, so, and you can really add any note that you want in between the chord tones. You know, it just depends on kind of the sound you're going for and everything, you know. So, but I think it's kind of a cool concept to think of a way to avoid certain intervals. If I don't want to play a augmented second interval, I can just also add the note after it, creating a flat 7 between that next note and the root note of that scale, as opposed to having to do an augmented second stretched interval, which gives you kind of that harmonic minor kind of sound and everything, which is great for metal and all kinds of music. But if you're playing jazz and bebop and stuff, you might want to play more of a combination of whole steps and half steps to give you more notes and not have to play that interval unless you want to, but you can avoid it by basically adding notes, you know. So really, I mean, if you think of it, the most simple, you know, as long as you play the chord tones, the notes in between the chord tones kind of are variable. Now, you can also think, if you're playing B diminished 7, you're playing like a G7 flat 9, and that kind of gives you another thought. You would have to, if you wanted to kind of stick with that, you would want to play a G in your scale. So that would be another thought, you know, if you're thinking of, do all of these scales have a G in them? You know, I guess they do. Now, one other last thought is basically, if you're playing the 2+1 scale, okay, so the symmetrical diminished scale, if you go a half step down and start from there, it's called the symmetrical dominant scale. So if you think of it like this, if you have a B flat 7 chord, dominant chord, okay, and you just move your finger up here, and then it becomes B diminished 7, right? So B flat 7, B diminished 7, B flat 7, right? So that means if I just start the scale here, you're going to basically have a half step after the B flat, right? But if I started from B, I'm going to have a whole step to C sharp right after that. So it's the same exact scale, it's just thinking of how those chords kind of connect in that way. Now, if you're only thinking of a B diminished 7 chord, you could actually think of, I could actually play the half whole scale from B, right? Okay, which actually would work. It gives you all the chord tones of a B diminished 7th scale, so you can kind of invert it that way. However, usually we think of B diminished 7 coming from the 5 chord, which would be G, okay? So G, if we think of it from that angle, would be a G7 flat 9, because you have A flat, right? So if you think of this scale and you invert it to doing the symmetrical dominant in the spot you're supposed to do the symmetrical diminished, meaning if you start on B and do a half step up, that's all fine and dandy, but once you get up here, you actually never play G. So you're going to be playing G flat, F sharp, same thing, or A flat. You're going to be skipping over G. So in that context, it's not quite as usable, and it's directly related to this connection between the half step up above the dominant chord creates the diminished 7th shape, right? So basically, so the one to stick with is doing the whole half scale for that reason. But you could really kind of work in and out of it, you know? Like, I like to think of all possibilities, but for the most part, the best one to do is, you know, the one that matches it, because that would give you a G natural in that scale. You know, so you want that.